Hi, it's Paul and Dan from Bible Feed, back with another podcast. I know it's been a little bit of time since we last did a podcast. I think it was probably December, January, and here we are, nearly in June, and we're back with another one. I know it's been too long, but here we are. What we're going to do in our podcast in this episode is to pick apart one or two verses in the Gospel of John. Now, we've done an overview of the Gospel of John a little while ago, and we highlighted the unique language that is used in the Gospel of John. And I think we highlighted the grand opening passage of John 1. And I think we likened it to a piece of music by Richard Strauss that forms the backdrop to the opening sequence of 2001: A Space Odyssey. I'm not quite sure how successful we were in making that connection. It's got the 7 signs in it. And we did touch on some phrases in the Gospel, but it was an overview of the book, so we didn't really look in depth. But that's what we're going to do now. There are many famous verses in John's Gospel, but we're going to home in on one of the most famous verses in John's Gospel. It's in John chapter 14, and it contains this phrase, "In my Father's house are many mansions." Dan, welcome. Where is this going to take us?
Hi, Paul. It's good to be here again, isn't it? And this is, a good topic, I think, because we're going to be looking at a really popular verse, a really enduring verse. And they're the words of the King James Version, aren't they? The translation of the King James Bible.
Yeah.
In my Father's house are many mansions. Jesus says in John 14, verse 1, from the King James, "Let not your heart be troubled. Ye believe in God, believe also in me. In my Father's house are many mansions. If it were not so, I would have told you. I go to prepare a place for you, and if I go and prepare a place for you, I will come again and receive you unto myself, that where I am, there ye may be also." I think this verse, or this passage I've just read, in particular, can be used at funerals quite a bit for reasons we'll come to. It's very much a verse seen as so comforting. But maybe before we kick off and try and examine that and work out whether the use of it is correct and whether the general perception of what this verse is about, whether that's correct, maybe I'll ask you a question, Paul. What is the Lord's Prayer? How does that start with?
Okay, you're testing me now. The Lord's Prayer, "Our Father, which art in heaven, hallowed be thy name."
Yeah, that's good. Okay.
Yeah.
Our Father, which art in heaven. Okay. So that's very much taken as read. God is in heaven. People are on earth. Surely he's talking about heaven. That's, I think, the idea there, and why this is a verse that gives grieving people comfort of hoping for that their loved ones are somewhere in heaven, in a mansion, whatever. That's an interesting translation, isn't it?
Yeah.
From the old version there.
Yeah.
And the idea of heaven being the dwelling place of God is absolutely clear, isn't it, throughout the Bible? Psalm 115, "The heavens are the Lord's heavens, but the earth he has given to the children of man." Isaiah 40, "It's he who sits above the circle of the earth, and its inhabitants are like grasshoppers. He who stretches out the heavens like a curtain and spreads them like a tent to dwell in." So this idea of God up there, dwelling in heaven, and here we all are as ants on the earth, that kind of idea.
Yeah, and so that you can see why that is a comforting verse that might be used in the context of something like a funeral. It's a verse about the comfort about those that have died, going to be with Jesus in heaven. That's it, isn't it? It's as simple as that.
Yeah, we can find this interpretation probably in any kind of commentary on John or anything that discusses John's Gospel. For example, James Montgomery Boyce, in a book, Foundations of the Christian Faith, says the first few verses of John 14 are among the most popular in the Bible. So, reinforcing what we've just said. They speak about heaven, but the reason for their popularity is not that they reveal details about heaven or even about life beyond the grave. So he's saying there isn't really much detail about it, but carry on. Later in the paragraph he says, "Why is John 14 so popular? The answer is probably because of the warm image that is found there. Heaven is a home. We need a home. We long for a home. Jesus calmly told his troubled disciples that we have one." And he talks about Jesus preparing a home for us in heaven. So there's just one example. And even if you look up in the Lexham Bible Dictionary, the entry under Father's house, it says in the New Testament, it refers figuratively to the Jerusalem temple or paradise. And that's where it says John 14, verse 2. So that uses that as a basis there, though it can refer to a family residence as well. So there we go.
Okay, so there's a couple of commentaries there and definitions from different sources, but scholars of the Bible, let's take them seriously, But we've looked at topics before, and on some occasions we have come to different conclusions from what might be the mainstream interpretation of verses. So we've, for example, done episodes on the soul, and we've also looked at phrases like the kingdom of heaven. We looked at that when we did a series on Matthew's gospel, because Matthew uses that phrase repeatedly in his gospel. And the conclusions that we came to, that these concepts of a soul or the kingdom of heaven, that wasn't really teaching. The biblical teaching wasn't about a literal soul going to heaven when you die kind of doctrine. And I think we quoted a number of other scholars, Bible scholars, in support of that view, that it's not teaching the idea of a soul that goes to heaven when you die. But here we've got these verses in John chapter 14, which are often being used to think about that sort of concept of where we go when we die, going to heaven, Jesus preparing a place in heaven, and people going there to be with him, to be home with him in heaven when they die. Do we need to rethink and just step back and think about the conclusions that we drew before?
It's always good to rethink, isn't it? It's always good to be continually looking at, and that's the definition of an open mind. So yeah, let's examine this and see if it is talking about going to heaven. See if it is about that. So if we're going to try and understand it, Paul, what would we do? If we're looking at a verse, if we want to study it, to try and make sure we understand what it means, what would we do?
Context is king. I think we may have said on a few of these before. So certainly we look at the context and look at what came before these verses and what comes after. And we'd maybe think a little bit about any terms in there that are relevant to the ancient culture in the first century. How does that fit into the wider sequence of ideas in the book or the section of writing that we're dealing with?
Yeah, absolutely. So let's do that then. And first of all, let's just look in the text immediately.
It's that simple, isn't it?
Let's just do that. But it's available to everyone, and that's the thing, isn't it? So it's a bit of time, and we've got to check our biases and all that kind of thing. But it is there, ready and available to you. Chapter 13 is just there. So let's look back, and in the immediate context, where is John 14 in the context of what's happening? Where is Jesus? What's he saying? Who's he talking to?
When we did the overview, I think we divided it more or less into two sections. We had chapters, the introduction, and then chapters 1 to 12, I think, were the piece with the 7 signs in, and it had the raising of Lazarus. And then this section, kind of 13 to about 17, is a lot of it's the words of Jesus. And a lot of it's actually in the upper room. It's either in the upper room where he has the meal with his disciples, or on the way out to the Garden of Gethsemane.
Yeah.
So somewhere upper room, or
that's right,
on the way out.
Yeah, so I think he's in the upper room still here.
Yeah.
And he's talking to his disciples, and it literally is the night before he's about to be crucified and killed.
Yeah.
That's something he knows is coming. That's what's going to happen to him. He knows he's going to his death. That's important, I think, to remember. We've just read in the verses in chapter 14, it talks about, I'm going somewhere. If I go to prepare a place. And that's an interesting idea, isn't it? I'm going. We know he's literally going to go off and die. So let's just back at some of these verses here in John 13. Jesus says, verse 31, now is the Son of Man glorified, and God is glorified in him. Verse 33, little children, yet a little while I am with you. You will seek me, and just as I said to the Jews, so now I also say to you, where I am going, you cannot come. So there you go. He's talking in the context about going away. And what is it that it's what is it about? Verse 36, Simon Peter says, he asks that very question, Lord, where are you going? Jesus answered him, where I am going, you cannot follow me now, but you will follow afterward. So what's he talking about there? Verse 37, Peter said, Lord, why can I not follow you now? I will lay down my life for you. And there's the kind of bitter irony there, isn't it? Because this is precisely what Jesus means. He knows he's going to his death, and he knows that Peter cannot follow him. But literally, he will turn and run away. He'll deny him and go away. And he says, with the greatest of courage and just faith, that he wants to serve Jesus in that moment. And it's wonderful. But the sad thing is he turns in that crucial moment and will deny Jesus. So verse 38, Jesus answered, Will you lay down your life for me? Truly I say to you, the rooster will not crow till you have denied me 3 times. Let not your hearts be troubled. Believe in God, believe also in me. In my Father's house are many rooms. If it were not so, would I have told you that I go to prepare a place for you? I will come again and take you to myself, that where I am, you may be also. So in context about this going is, I think, what do you think the going away is in context?
Well, it looks like that. And in some ways, the having the break in the chapter from 13 to 14 isn't that helpful, because it makes you think chapter 14 is starting some new dialogue, and it is absolutely following on from the issues and the conversation, it seems. So when he says, where I am going, that sounds like he's now talking about going to his death, to his crucifixion. And he in fact said there, didn't he, that he's saying the same thing to his disciples that he said to the Jews on earlier occasions, that he's going somewhere that they cannot come. And so it isn't really about going to another place like an off-world location, whatever heaven might be. The context is not about that at all. The emphasis is all about Jesus going to his death, and Peter's not going to be able to follow in that. But chapter 14 introduces this phrase about my Father's house. So if Jesus is going to his death, what does the Father's house mean in this context then, if it's not heaven, the dwelling place of God?
Yeah, okay. So we need to think about that, because that it sounds like it's the Father's house where he's going to prepare places, doesn't it? And but these are all metaphors, aren't they? You can't have a GPS coordinate for where Jesus is going to, because it's not a place, it's a metaphor. The journey of going somewhere is a metaphor for the fact that he's laying down his life. So when Peter says, oh, where are you going? I'll follow you. He doesn't understand. And that happens all the way through John, doesn't it? People don't fully understand what Jesus is saying. So we need to then think, okay, so what does my Father's house mean? And let's take a cue back. Do you remember that definition from the Lexham Bible Dictionary? There's another possible definition that they gave there, which was the temple. And I'll just read to you John chapter 2. Jesus comes into the temple, verse 14. In the temple he found those who were selling oxen, sheep and pigeons, and the money changers there. And it's the famous incident, or one of the famous incidents, where he drives out the people. And he says, take these things away. Do not make my Father's house a house of trade. Okay? So very clearly, my Father's house in John 2 at least, is referring to the temple. So there's the literal temple there in Jerusalem. It makes a reference to the temple, which probably doesn't really solve anything at the moment. It might even raise a load more questions, actually.
But it is a definition of Father's house that isn't heaven.
Yeah.
And the temple is a significant concept. But then if we're talking about him going, actually in John chapter 14, it doesn't say Jesus is going to his Father's house. It just says, in my Father's house are many rooms.
That's right.
It just then say, I go to prepare a place for you. Father's house can mean temple. Jesus didn't go and die in the temple.
No.
There must be something else going on here.
Yeah.
About the meaning of Father's house and temple.
Yeah. All sorts of other ideas that need unpacking here now. And maybe a little bit of the sort of cultural context. Or when I say that, I just mean, what would the Israelites, what would these people understand by the temple?
So we've looked at the textual context of the verses before and after. Now we're looking at cultural context and background to the passage.
Yeah, not necessarily. Our own assumptions might be that Father's house means heaven straight away, but some people, or it means the temple. Well, what does the temple actually mean? And this is where, curiously, we're going to find there's actually like a connection between these two things, the temple and heaven. So because the Jewish temple was a little microcosm of heaven, or indeed of the whole cosmos of heaven and earth, it symbolized the fact that God is everywhere in the world, and indeed the idea of God dwelling in heaven was really just a metaphor for his sort of supremacy anyway. Maybe the best thing to do is quote a couple of passages. In 2 Chronicles 6, verse 18, this is when the temple was built, Solomon's temple, and Solomon the king at the time, he has a big, long prayer of dedication, and this is one part of what he says. He says, will God indeed dwell with man on the earth? Bear in mind, he's just spent however long, 7 years or whatever it took to build this temple, glamorous and amazing thing that he's just built. and is actually God's not going to dwell here. So, will God indeed dwell with man on the earth? Behold, heaven and the highest heaven cannot contain you. How much less this house that I've built? There you go. There's an appreciation there, isn't there, that the temple is just a symbol. This is the house of God, my Father's house, but it's just a symbol of God's presence. Okay.
Yeah.
There's another really interesting passage in Isaiah chapter 66. So this is the last chapter in the big prophecy of Isaiah. So Isaiah says, "Thus says the Lord, heaven is my throne, and the earth is my footstool. What is the house that you would build for me, and what is the place of my rest? All these things my hand has made, and so all these things came to be, declares the Lord." So here again, heaven is my throne. That's where God dwells.
Okay.
The earth is my footstool. What is the house that you would build for me? So you've got this almost tension in the Jewish understanding here of building these temples, or building a temple, sorry, the one temple in Jerusalem, which is the house of God. But they know it's not really the house of God. God is everywhere.
Yeah.
Or God is in heaven. But they know God isn't really in heaven, the sky. He's not there. He's everywhere. He is behind everything. The God that's made everything. So that's this kind of tension here. And the interesting thing here is we've got a link between something that might be a bit surprising. Isaiah says, God says through Isaiah, all these things my hand has made, and so all these things came to be. So you can't just build a house for me. But this is the one to whom I will look. He who is humble and contrite in spirit and trembles at my word. So you go from a building, I don't actually literally dwell in a building, but I'm looking at and interested in people. I'm interested in people to experience my presence, to know about me, to realize that I am the God, and he wants people to allow God to dwell in their lives and be manifest. So we've got an interesting idea now, where we've gone from the idea of the temple being a picture of heaven, a picture of the cosmos, but actually a symbol of God's willingness or God's desire to come and dwell with people, to be with people. Back in John 14, we started off with the King James translation, didn't we? Where in my Father's house are many it sounds lovely, doesn't it? It paints the picture of a nice villa on the French Riviera or something. Where's your favourite place to have a mansion? Yeah. But it's not an ideal translation, really. It's rooms, as we've seen the ESV translates it, or really just dwelling places. This is a home. So that's maybe the quote I started with, this idea of a home. That's really what it's about. It's about a place for people to make home. And there's a few things we still need to connect. So we need to, we've gone off on lots of different ways. Hopefully you're still with me, Paul. But I just want to go back to John now.
I think so.
Okay. I'm going to ask you to summarize in a minute. So in the John, back into John's Gospel, what we get is a picture. We're introduced to Jesus. In John chapter 1, verse 14, the Word became flesh and dwelt among us. We have seen his glory. Glory as of the only Son from the Father, full of grace and truth. So Jesus is introduced to the world. He shows up, and it turns out that he is full of God's glory, like God's grace and truth. It's like he is now a little dwelling place for God. And remember, Isaiah says, really he's interested in the people who tremble at my word, who basically see the authority in God's word, and they're humble and so on. Jesus was like that, a little walking temple, a little walking human who showed God's glory, who showed God's presence in his life. And finally, let's go back to John chapter 2, And this is where Jesus said about my Father's house.
Yeah.
Take these things away.
Throwing out the money changers.
That's right.
And so on.
My Father's house, do not make my Father's house a house of trade, And the Jews were a bit upset by this, so they say, what sign do you show us for doing these things? Jesus answered them, destroy this temple, and in 3 days I will raise it up. And the Jews are a bit outraged by that, as you can understand, because it's taken 46 years to build this temple, and will you raise it up in 3 days, they say. And here's the crunch, verse 21, but he was speaking about the temple of his body. When therefore he was raised from the dead, his disciples remembered he said this, and they believed the scripture and the word that Jesus had spoken. So, mind blown currently, maybe. Lots of different things which we need to just pull together, and hopefully, Paul, you might be able to summarize.
Yeah. And maybe we're following a little bit the journey of the disciples of Jesus as well.
Yeah.
Here's this account of what Jesus did, and they saw this, and he was talking about raising it up in 3 days. But then that verse 21 that you've just read from John 2 is a comment afterwards. But Jesus was speaking about the temple of his body. We didn't realize it at the time, but now we get it after Jesus has died and raised. And when therefore he was raised from the dead, his disciples remembered that he had said this, and they believed. So you want me to summarize now? So Jesus, when he's talking about going, he's talking about his death, which was about to happen just on the following day. And at that point, the disciples don't really understand what's about to take place, what momentous events are about to take place. They've not really got an idea of what Jesus means at this stage. Or they're like Peter, who's saying, I will go to death with you, as well as perhaps he's in a little bit of a revolutionary kind of mindset and thinking along those lines. But what Jesus knows is that he is the only one, because he is this embodiment of the grace and truth and the character of God, being the Son of God, that he's the one that will lay down his life. And no one else can do it. Therefore, Peter, no one else can go to that death that Jesus is about to go to. Where I go, you cannot come. So he does then need to come again in order to be with them again. And that, from that passage in John chapter 2 there, it's after he was raised from the dead. They understood this, and he came again. He appeared to them again after his resurrection, and after, whatever this means, after he's gone to that death and resurrection and prepared places for people in rooms in this Father's house, like temple of people thing concept. How am I doing?
I think pretty good.
Okay.
I think we're showcasing the Gospel of John and its depth very well by fumbling our way through it.
Yeah, good. So in going to his death, that metaphorically prepares many dwelling places, is what he said, places for people to dwell. And it seems like those places that people can now dwell in because of what Jesus has done, give them the same kind of dwelling in the presence of God that Jesus experienced. And it comes up later in the New Testament writings, doesn't it, about people being in Christ and being part of. In fact, Paul writes to communities of believers in different places and says, you are the temple of the living God. They're people where God's presence and through Jesus and God is dwelling there. And somehow Jesus going to the place that no one else could go to his death, facilitates many other people to come to that relationship with God, to experience the grace and truth of God and be with it.
Yeah, that's pretty good. I think what we've been asked to do is look at it not with that kind of literal mindset, because that's where everyone through John keeps misunderstanding Jesus, don't they? That when Jesus said certain things, he says, I and the Father are one. And people are like, what? And then he has to explain. Yeah. We've done an episode on that. Yeah. There's other things he says. So here he says, I'm going and you can't come. And they're like, what? Where are we? Surely we can just follow you. And he's talking on another level. So it's tuning into that level.
Yeah.
Destroy this temple and I'll raise it in 3 days. How can you do that? Again, he's talking on a different level. So hopefully by pulling on those threads a little bit, we've almost peeled it back a little bit and we can see the level that Jesus is talking on.
Yeah.
And we can get a sense of how profound this is. Because it's all about God not dwelling in a building, not being just physically in the skies or something like that. That's not what it's really about. Yeah. God wants his presence to be felt. He wants people to feel his presence to be there.
Yeah. And as I was summarizing, that's the kind of thing the kind of phrases I was using about people being able to experience something, a relationship in the presence of God, grace and truth. So what does that feel like? When somebody has that, do they look different? What is that?
Again, it might be really hard to say, communicate. You're not going to look different or anything like that. But maybe just looking at towards the end of the chapter again, Jesus says something else in chapter 14 and 20. Let's read verse 21. Whoever has my commandments and keeps them, he it is who loves me, and he who loves me will be loved by my Father, and I will love him and manifest myself to him. Judas, not Iscariot, said to him, Lord, how is it that you will manifest yourself to us and not to the world? Jesus answered him.
So he's just asking the question that I just asked.
Exactly. There you go. Yeah. What is it?
Excellent.
And again, that should make us feel comforted. People didn't get, the disciples didn't get it. Jesus is the riddler, isn't he? He's riddles. And then he said, if anyone loves me, he will keep my word, and my Father will love him, and we will come to him and make our home with him. And home there is the same Greek word as that word that's translated mansions or rooms early in the chapter.
So that's very much about their lives there and then, isn't it?
Sure.
After Jesus had raised anyone, after that point, who loves him, keeps his word, then there's that home for someone.
Yeah, that's right.
For anyone.
Yeah. And again, it might be hard to fully express in words what that is, other than the fact that this is about, as the whole of the Bible's about, a renewal of person, isn't it? A renewal of character. He wants people to manifest the love of God in their lives. What's it said about keeping my word and having the commandments and keeping them? This is about how you live your life practically day by day. Isaiah 66 we looked at. God was interested in the people who are humble and contrite and who tremble at the word of God. So again, they're moved by God's message. It changes them and they live out it in their lives. This is a really practical message for people.
So in that sense, you could see a change in someone. They could look different. They could.
Yeah.
There's an appreciation of, I now have a place that I belong, that I'm at home in, if you like, in that relationship with God through Jesus, and start to do things differently, start to talk differently and approach the world differently.
Yeah.
So maybe it would be something that is a visible change.
Yeah, no, that's a good point, actually, because there's quite a bit we've missed out of chapter 14, but actually part of it, Jesus has said about whoever has seen me has seen the Father. So again, visibly, if he walks out in the street and does what he does and says what he says, you can see, oh, he's different. He's showing the Father. And that's the call for us. That's the charge that we need to follow.
And actually, maybe there's another little bit in John's Gospel that speaks to that. When Jesus had this conversation with Nicodemus in John chapter 3, John talks about being born of water and born of the Spirit. And he says this being born of the Spirit is like the wind in the trees. You see the effect. The trees move, but you can't see the wind, but you see the effect of it. That seems a little bit like this, that someone who has responded in this way and to Jesus, what he's done in this relationship with God, something changes. You can't see what's changed them, but you can see the effect of it.
Yeah, I think so.
Okay. So Jesus in that, let's just go back to that chapter 14 and verse 1 and 2. Because Jesus said in there, if I go and prepare a place, I will come again. Now, in the context of the broader New Testament, there is a lot of talk about Jesus coming again, of Jesus returning and appearing again on earth. So even though we've looked at this verse and we've said, no, it isn't really about souls that go to heaven when you die, although it is incredibly comforting, but in a different way and with a different kind of point in its context. But there is a sense in which Jesus will come again as a return to earth. So is that something in this verse as well?
It could well be, because of the levels at which Jesus is operating. There's many sort of profound levels he's talking through. I wonder if here the emphasis isn't there. The emphasis, despite that being a really solid teaching of the New Testament, Jesus is to come again. In this context, it seems a little bit like the emphasis here is more on the fact that he's going to his death, will lay down his life, and that will prepare something because of his resurrection from the dead. And he'll come again through his resurrection and appearance, and that whole thing that's happened will be there, and it can change people, and they can receive him and have that home, have that dwelling place. So that, I think the coming again is primarily that. It's this kind of people are living lives where they're influenced by the presence of God, in the sense they're aware of it, and they're aware of God's word, and their lives are being renewed in that way. So they're living those lives, which are the lives that are characterized by that kingdom that will fill this world. When Jesus does come again, in that sense, when he talks, we could turn to somewhere like other parts of the New Testament, Thessalonians and all sorts, where Jesus is to come again, and then the world will be full of people living those sorts of lives. The amazing thing is, I think, in this passage, that it's not just a complete waiting game. Actually, there's a real wonderful opportunity for us right here, right now, to have and experience that and to live like it now. And that's not just a wonderful opportunity, a kind of real privilege and responsibility to know of Jesus and to live him in our lives and to show him to others. That's this kind of, that's what it's all about. So yeah, maybe there's a sense there in that future coming, but I wonder if primarily the emphasis just in this passage specifically is about the coming after death, coming and returning to life.
Okay, so we probably need to wrap up, but we have really just dived into these a couple of verses, and it's taken us to some interesting places. And as we started, we talked about this as a verse that might frequently be used at funerals, but even if it's not really saying perhaps what the assumed meaning is in a funeral context, it is still something that Jesus is saying that is incredibly profound and comforting for life now and how we approach and view the world and our place in it, but also with that little hint of there's a time when Jesus comes again. And the resurrection itself is a portent of that hope of resurrection, whatever life might throw at us now. And so there are many rooms. There's room for anyone. It's not limited by a 36-bedroom mansion type idea. It's limitless in terms of who can listen and hear and believe and act on that and be part of this living temple that God is building. So thank you very much, Dan, for taking us through that. We will be back with further Bible Feed podcasts. Hopefully it won't take us another 5 or 6 months before we put the next one out. So thank you very much for listening, and we will be back soon. But in the meantime, take a look at biblefeed.org, the website, and look at our posts on Facebook and Instagram and wherever else we happen to appear.
Great, thanks, Paul.
Thank you and goodbye. Until next time.